Hey again everybody, it's time to do 11.3 video, and I was going to add Christmas music, it is the season, but I couldn't really find any that I could upload on the computer. Maybe I'll find some later and whatever. It's just fluff anyway, because we're going to talk about some definitions of traditional farming procedures. And then we're going to get into the good alternative farming procedures. And I think that'll take up this whole video. And then there'll be one more before the midterm exam. And that last one will be about fish and meat harvesting. So let's get started with some more farming techniques. We can't really start dealing with these alternative methods until we get a firm grasp and a definition of some of the bad farming methods. So even though this heading says alternatives, we're going to start with the industrial methods, and not just industrial methods, but also what they're doing in LEDCs to grow crops, because they're not very helpful to the environment either. So here are some of the traditional farming methods. First of all, we have conventional agriculture. This is what we use in our country. Unfortunately, it's also known as agribusiness or industrial agriculture. And what we're talking about here is monocropping. This is where farmers grow one crop and only one crop to get maximum yield. Acres and acres and acres, all the same crop. Of course, that's not very good for the soil. In addition to that, this agribusiness, these really, really large farms, have kind of squeezed out the family farm, and that farmer who might be more inclined to do things in a more environmentally friendly way is kind of squeezed out. So you get these big companies running huge farms and doing it all for profit. Traditional farming is still used in developing countries, and really what we're talking about here, when you see traditional farming, think no tractors. Think about the farmer who's got oxen pulling, cultivating implements, and also just human activities. Lots of individual manual labor doing the work in traditional farming. Shifting agriculture is used in areas with nutrient-poor soils. It involves planting an area for a few years until that land is depleted. No nutrients means they have to move on to another area and repeat the process. You might have heard of slash and burn agriculture. That is the same as shifting agriculture. When we operate in this way, the nutrient-poor soil is just left, and it can't be farmed anymore. So now we have a big problem with something called desertification. Desertification is making the farmland like a desert. The soil is really nothing more than sand left behind. And you'll see an example here in Africa, where the actual desert itself is pushing its way south into areas that were once used for farming. So get that definition. Let me find it here in the book. We're on page 295, by the way. Desertification is turning the soil into something that's unusable, especially if the soil was already arid or semi-arid. In addition, because it's a semi-arid region, lots of watering, lots of irrigation is required to keep the crops going. And I think I've mentioned this to you before. Salt ends up building up in the soil. And in fact, the soil becomes so salty, salinization, that annual crops fail to grow. This salinization happens because lots of irrigation is used, The water does have trace amounts of salt in it. Yes, even your drinking water has trace amounts of salt in it. And that water sits on land because the water is so overused, evaporates, and when the water evaporates, that water vapor goes into the atmosphere, and what gets left behind is the salt. So that's salinization of soil. Keep thinking of that when you think of desertification, kind of the same ideas. And then we have this thing about nomadic grazing. Now this is not about growing crops, but this is about grazing cattle. And the idea of nomadic grazing is for the farmer who's in charge of the livestock to just make sure that they move it, just like a nomad would move. Make sure you move from place to place to find productive feeding grounds. The problem is with nomadic grazing, it's not very organized. So the same farmer may come back the next year, and that grassland really hasn't had an opportunity to make it back all the way, and they will graze on that again. All right, here's a video showing you some of these unsustainable farming techniques, and in particular this concept of desertification.
Industrialized agriculture in developed countries usually involves growing large fields of monoculture crops. Traditional farmers in developing countries, however, often grow several crops in the same field. This practice is known as interplanting. By planting a diverse mix of crops, there is less chance of losing everything due to pests, bad weather, and other disasters. There are several types of interplanting. Polyvarietal cultivation involves planting a field with several varieties of the same crop. Planting two or more different crops in a field at the same time is known as intercropping. One crop is usually a nitrogen user, such as a grain, while the other crop is a nitrogen producer, such as a legume. Alley cropping involves planting crops between rows of trees. The trees may provide a source of fruits or nuts. The most complex method of interplanting is known as polyculture. It involves planting together many different types of crops that mature at different times.
Okay, so all of these methods add to something that we call sustainable agriculture. Sustainable agriculture is producing enough food to feed the world's population without destroying the land, without polluting the environment, and without reducing biodiversity. So it is taking all of the environmental issues that we're talking about here into account while we produce the food necessary to feed the world. Okay, that's all about the growing seasons and growing crops, but you might recall from an earlier video, pesticides are a big problem. Well, there's an environmental solution to pesticides also, and it is called integrated pest management. Integrated pest management, acronym IPM. IPM is a big deal in environmental science. It is the pesticide solution. And basically this is how it works. You've got to go to a farmer and talk to them about doing some analysis of their crops and of their land. You know, they have a tendency when they see a pest in their fields to start spraying. They may even apply way more pesticide than is necessary to kill the pest. We already talked about the fact that pesticides stay in the environment for a long period of time. They have persistence. So we need to get farmers to use less and less of them. And that's what integrated pest management does. It uses analysis. It gets farmers to actually do the math and do calculations about how much pesticide has to be used. By doing this, we educate them, and we also help them understand that they're probably, in most cases they are, wasting money because they're spraying way more pesticide on their crops than they actually needed to. In addition, to actually educating farmers about the amount of pesticides that they ought to use. There are also other techniques that farmers can use. For instance, planting pest-resistant crops. You plant crops that don't attract these pests, and you won't lose a significant amount of your yield to the pest. Intercropping is a good idea because different crops have different pests that attack them. And if you grow all the same crop on your land and the pest shows up, well, you're in big trouble. You could lose your whole livelihood for that year. With intercropping, one crop may get damaged by the pest, but the other crop will be fine. And it's the same way with crop rotation. These are all important techniques that are used to decrease the amount of pesticide required. There's even the use of the pest's predator. Add the pest's predator to your farmland. That predator attacks the pests, and as long as it's done wisely, that predator won't do any other damage in the ecosystem. I know of farmers that actually grow plants on the side of their property that create a habitat for the predator, creates the habitat for the predator, so the predator can live on his farm. And then he just scoops them up and adds them to his crop when the pest shows up. The important thing about IPM is there's a limited use of pesticides and cost-benefit analysis is used. The farmer knows how much to apply and not waste his money. And you can see from this graph that's on page 299, after farmers are trained in IPM, there's a much lower, cut in half, the amount of pesticide that's used. But look at the yields. There's actually a better yield for the farmer after they receive their IPM training. This is the solution to pest management in the modern farming world. IPM. You've heard an awful lot about organic agriculture. Here are the principles involved with organic agriculture. I think the most important thing for you to understand is this is an effort to work with natural systems. Instead of just trying to make money off the land, you're trying to work with nature to produce a crop that will feed people. Farmer makes money, but nature is not harmed. The soil's not harmed. The ecosystem is not damaged. It strives to keep as much of the organic matter and nutrients in the soil as possible. Organic farmers avoid using inorganic fertilizers, so-called synthetic fertilizers, fertilizers that are made in a chemical factory, and they avoid using pesticides. They maintain their soil through natural means, biological activity, intercropping, things like that, polyvarietal farming, and it reduces adverse effects on the environment. Today, we do have the Organic Foods Production Act, and that establishes uniform national standards so that when you buy something that says organically grown, it has to meet these certain conditions. These conditions change over time based on how the law changes. But what's important here is you can feel safe that when you buy an organically grown fruit or vegetable at Publix or any other grocery store, that it meets some sort of minimum standards. The organic movement is huge today, as you might imagine. It's a big deal in lots of other states. People go to farmers markets. They want to get local agriculture. They want to buy from the local farmers. If you go to Publix and just buy an apple, you may be getting an apple from Oregon or from Washington State. And there's not that there's anything wrong with that, but if you're going to try to reduce the adverse environmental effects of agriculture, You don't want to have your apples shipped all the way across country, all of the greenhouse gases that's produced in the transport of these things, all of the preservatives that have to be used to keep them fresh while they're transported. You can understand that going to your local farmer's market, buying fresh fruits and vegetables, is the environmental way to go. Maybe some of your parents do this even today. There's a lot of farming that happens in the state of Florida, and you can get local farmers market products that have not traveled very far. And if they're organically grown, no synthetic fertilizers or pesticides were used. There is a store out where the silos are on Route 20. There is an organic agriculture there's an organic agriculture store there. Okay, so we got interrupted by a phone call, but I think I was done basically with all the things we needed to cover in that section anyway. So one section left, and I think it's pretty short. There's a couple little those animations in it, and that's about it. So one more to go. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.